So today, usual structure for this session, we'll spend the first 10 to 15 minutes talking about topics for this week, which are conditional rendering and control components. And then we'll explore these topics through adding a search functionality into our blog, which we talked a little bit about last week, but never got around to it. So this week we'll actually go ahead and start building that out using these concepts. Of course, if there's any other questions that people have that are unrelated to these things, just feel free to jump in and bring them up, put them in the chat. We'll make sure we'll get to those as well. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about these two concepts. So first, conditional rendering. Hopefully, as the name suggests, it's this idea of you decide to render a component or some piece of a component conditionally based on the value of some variable per se. So typically this is used in concert with state variables or props that we've talked about. You can see an example here on the right of what that looks like. And just to get some of your kind of juices flowing in terms of why this is useful, I put some example use cases here on the left that you will see this come up in. So for example, let's say you're showing a list of items and there's nothing in the list at some point in time. You don't just want to have the screen be blank. You might want to put some sort of empty or loading state in there if the data is loading, or if it's just there's nothing there, it would load an empty state. So that would be something that you would want to show in that case. Another one would be if there's some sort of pop-up on screen that you want to show, you will typically set that up again using conditional rendering. You'll have some sort of state variable that's true or false, whether you should show that element or not, and then you'll render it based on the value of that state. So just some common examples that you'll see this idea come up in. And then you can see on the right-hand side, here in the code block, there's two ways that you would have read about if you read the materials for this week for using conditional rendering. So one would be using the ternary operator here, which is this top segment here. And let me turn the annotation tool on. You know what I'm talking about. So that's this segment here that I'm highlighting in the green. So the ternary operator is using this question mark and then this colon that you might recognize just from good old JavaScript syntax here. So it just essentially says here, right, if essentially show big, this variable here is true, then we'll render out the big component. Otherwise, we'll render out the small component. And this will take care of most situations. In the situation where you only want to show something if something is true or something is false, then you can use this shorthand double ampersand operator here to kind of shorthand that in one go using, again, a feature of just basic JavaScript here. So if, in this case, visible is true, then you will show the child component. Otherwise, if visible is false, it'll just skip this whole thing altogether. And if you were here a couple weeks ago, we kind of actually started using some of this early, which I'll also point out again today. So using this sort of same syntax. Questions on conditional rendering? All right, let's keep chugging along then, and we'll see this in action as well. So actually, let's just do a live example right now. So this idea I was talking about with empty states before. So here's a very simple component that we have here. In this case, a list of recipes, and in this case, this component takes in recipes array as a prop. And right now, we're just mapping over this recipes array, and we're rendering each one out in some recipe card component that exists somewhere else. Now, let's say we wanted to implement an empty state here. So specifically, if there's no recipes being passed in, then we want to display something indicating that there's nothing there. How do we go about doing that using the conditional rendering concept? And feel free to just jump in with ideas here. Yep. Okay. So Anthony puts the ternary operator. Do you want to say more, Anthony?
Um, so yeah, we could put a condition in the fragment to say that if we have like let's say something out of the recipes, it should render this. If not, it should probably not render anything.
Cool. Yep. That's great. And so let's just click to the example I put here. So yeah, exactly what Anthony mentioned. Essentially, we set up this ternary, and just a reminder, because this is technically JavaScript, we have to wrap all this in curly braces. So you'll notice that here. And yeah, what we're checking here, the condition that I'm checking here in this example is recipes of an array. I'm checking if the length of the array is 0. Then in this case, I'm just displaying a simple H1 that says there's no recipes to show. Otherwise, we'll just show what we just had in the previous slide, which is just mapping up with the recipes. The one small nuance I will call out here, which is a bit of a detail, is notice that I had to wrap here a fragment, and I also had to wrap here a fragment. Now, the reason why is if you all were here for the session where we were talking about React fragments briefly and components, there was this rule in React that whenever you have a return statement, it has to return at least, or some expression that's returning something to render, it has to at least be in a single fragment, right? It has to be in a single component, whatever it's returning. So that is why in this case, we have to wrap everything here in a fragment, because otherwise we would just be returning this JavaScript block, which just would not work. Like React would yell at us and say like this doesn't work. And it's also the same reason why we have to embed in this conditional rendering this recipes.map also needs to be surrounded in a fragment, because otherwise we just be rendering out again just a JavaScript block, which just won't go with React. So there's some nuance there that we have to kind of use this fragment wrapping to get around that a little bit without introducing actual new elements in the tree structure. Questions on this example dealing with the ternary operator or with this conditional rendering?
Um, so I've seen a couple of examples somewhere. I'm not sure if it's kind of like similar, where you show like a skeleton style component if the data is loading or if it's not loaded yet. Would that be it?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. So yeah, another time this is often used as sort of structure is with loading states essentially. So what you would do in that case is you would have some sort you would create a state variable that essentially is a Boolean that says whether the data is loading or not. You might call it like is loading. And based on the value of that variable, if you're in a loading state, then you would show that skeleton or whatever you want to show. And then once that is loading is set to false, maybe after some data fetching, for example, then you would render out your normal UI. So yeah, you're right. This is you would use this exact sort of type of structure in that case as well. Any other questions before we move to talking a little bit more about controlled components? All right, let's keep moving then. All right, control components. So control components is a different way to deal with user inputs, essentially. So user input elements like text input and the other types of inputs like select drop downs or anything like that, radio buttons. It's a different way to work with it. So if you remember from last week, we talked about using references in React through the useRef hook to connect to these input elements, and then let's say if a button was clicked, then we would use that reference to get the value attached to that input element, right? So control components is sort of the kind of use ref approach is, I would say, the more traditional way of doing that sort of thing. Like even if you weren't using React, then we're just using normal JavaScript, you kind of do the same thing, right? You get some sort of reference to the element, and then you would do like the element dot value or element dot target dot value to get the value out of it. So this is like how do you do that in the constraints of React? But there's a more React way to do it, which would be the control components. And the basic idea, right, is you directly connect the value of that element up front to a state variable. So you can see here on the code snippet on the right hand side, you can just let's first go down to the actual. See, here we go. Let's first focus on what we're returning here at the bottom. So you can see here in what I've highlighted in green, we're just doing a simple form with an input and a button, right? So pretty straightforward. But notice what we're doing is we are saying for the input, the value of this input is we're assigning it to this value in purple, which is actually the state variable that we've created up here, which looks horrible rectangle. So let me try that again. But it connects to the use state up at the top. So we're directly now binding this state variable with this UI element so that whenever now the input or value in the input changes, it updates the state variable. And the way that's done is also through setting this on change on the input element and calling the set value here of e.target.value. So that's the type binding that we're doing here. Now on the surface, you can still do the same thing you did before in terms of, okay, let's say you press the button and you have this handle submit button or handle submit function. I'm still doing the e.prevent default, but now instead of going and saying e.target.value to get the whatever's in the input, I can just directly now access here the value state variable. So it's just a more convenient way to access that value and do whatever you want with it. Now, on the surface, that might seem like, what's the point of doing that? Because you're getting the same result. Again, I would say it's a more React way to do it, but it also unlocks other things that you can do. So for example, now that the value is stored in the state variable, you can use that state variable in different ways. So this is a hypothetical example. I could, in this case, say based on whatever the value is of this value state variable, I might decide to make the button disabled or not. Now that becomes quite simple. I just have to pass in the disabled property in the button tag and just set that Boolean to whether the value state variable is empty or not. So you can start to do interesting things then. Another interesting thing we can do now is because value is being constantly updated, we didn't talk yet much about use effects, but when we do, we'll see we can tie that together really interesting ways to just have some really nice interactivity with the entire experience that you just can't get if you just use a standard use route. So generally speaking, in React, this is the preferred way to deal with these input elements, is to use this kind of controlled component architecture, leveraging state and making everything kind of more Reacty in a sense. I just said a lot of things, so any questions on anything I just said? I'm happy to repeat any and all of it.
You might have already explained, but I'm still not sure why we have to use the user effect for this. Yeah, why we have to use the user effect.
Yeah, so I think for the purpose of strictly talking about control components, you can more or less ignore the use effect right now. Like you don't need to use effect for control components necessarily. I think what we will find out, I know we haven't, I know technically you were introduced to use effect last week, but we haven't really talked about the nuances with it yet. I think next week we'll get to more of the nuances with use effect. It just becomes really nice to couple control components with use effect to do some really interesting things. So just as a very simple example, and again, this might be a little bit confusing at this point, but in this very simple use effect I've set up here, what it's effectively doing is saying whenever the actual value of this value use state variable changes, console log that value. So I can only do that because I have a state variable, right, attached to it. So in effect, what this will do is every time I type in something new with the input, and we'll see this all in action here in a little bit, it will just console log out as things change. So you can just like that coupling is impossible if you just do the normal kind of use ref and then do all that. It really becomes you're able to do that because you've kind of connected everything up into a state variable, and now you can have access to all this other great stuff you can do in React. But strictly by itself, the use effect is like not required at all with control components. It's like a really nice add-on to work with control components.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. And I will, as we go through the live coding example, I will point out how like an example of where this sort of comes up. We probably won't implement it today just because we haven't talked about use effect a ton, but I'll at least point it out and we'll definitely implement it. I think probably next week when we go deeper into use effect. Other questions before we jump into some actual coding?
Is it only used mostly on input elements?
It is used on elements that have some user input. So I think input is obviously like the most common one, which is essentially like a text box, right? But the select elements, so like when you have a drop down, right, or a radio button, checkboxes, like all of those also, any sort of thing which is like a user input that you would typically find in a form is like a good approximation. All of those elements is where this kind of concept of control components would come into play. Other questions before we jump into the coding?
Could you please just explain that you state maybe I joined a bit later, that's why I couldn't catch why we use the state in there.
Yeah. Let me talk to that one more time. So let me clear this out and let's just bring up the drawing again. Okay. So what we're doing is first at the top we have set up this use state, right? We're just calling it value here, and in hindsight, value is probably a bad name for it. But we'll create this use state variable value, and then we have the setter that we set up, and it's just in this case to start an empty string. The purpose of this use state is to essentially mirror whatever is happening in this input tag, which is this text box, right, on the screen. So I want to just mirror whatever is in the input element. I want to mirror that in this use state variable. The way we connect it up is we have to pass two things in. First, we have to pass the value here, which is this first element. But the second, and that is essentially the again, bad naming, probably a choice I made here. The value in blue here at the bottom this is referring to the value that is in the text box, and the value in purple here is referring to the state variable. So what we're saying is the value in the text box should equal whatever is whatever is set currently in the value variable. So that's binding the values together. But then the second piece is we have to say, well, we need to make sure we update the state variable every time the input is changing. So that's where this onChange is being passed. So we're tapping the onChange listener of the input tag, and we're saying whenever there's a change, someone types something in, a new letter, or presses the backspace or whatever, we're going to make sure we set the value of the state variable to e.target.value, which is just whatever is the value in the new value that is being typed into the input box. So it's just a way we're coupling together essentially the user interface element with this data that we're storing. And then we have freedom to then take that data, in this case, the state variable, and do whatever we want with it elsewhere, right? We can access it here in the handle submit button. We can use it for other things like whatever we want to use for use state, we could do that, right? Now it just becomes a piece of data that we can use anywhere else. And we know it's always constantly in line with whatever is in this text box.
Yeah, thank you. Now it's clear for me. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, seeing no questions at the moment, obviously feel free to jump in if any come up. Let's hop into some live coding. Switch my screen share. All right. So just as a reminder for folks, so in case you're not caught up, what we're working on, we are building out this simple blog site. We've been building on it based on concepts over the last few weeks. Last week, we implemented this article counter. So every time we open one of these articles, we get the nice counter. And we have this button as well, which is the content here. So this is where we're at right now. But this week, I have a few things that I think we should try to do, all relate to implementing a search functionality. So I think very simply, we're going to add a search box with a button that allows us to search. We're going to type something into the search box, and we're going to, in this case, we're going to use it to search over the titles of the articles. And if there's any matching results, we'll have them show up in the list, and we'll have our search functionality. So there's some details here that we'll go through, but at a high level, that's what we're going to work towards building. Okay, so let's go down the list. So let's first add some very simple search UI. Pretty simple, we'll just have a text box and a button. So let's see how we might do this. I'm just going to go ahead and add it for now in the main app file, and then we could refactor this out to a separate component later, but I think it might be easiest now to just put it here. So I'm just going to comment out this switch articles button because it's not particularly useful at this point. But let's just go here underneath the header, and let's just add some simple UI. So I'm just going to put this all in the div. I'm just going to put a simple input and a simple button that will just say search. I will need to add some more properties here, but okay, we have a text box, we have a search button. Doesn't look the greatest, but that's fine. We'll work with it. Let's first focus on the functionality. I can type things in. Obviously nothing happens, but okay. We got basic UI. Easy one to check off the list. Now, let's implement this search functionality that we want. First, let's implement it using the use ref approach that you all saw last week, and then we'll kind of write it also using control components. So we have a simple UI. Any thoughts on how we would start going about implementing the search functionality, again, using kind of the use ref approach first?
We need to declare use ref or import.
Yep, that's a good start. So let's create that ref. So I'll call it input ref, use ref. We'll need to import this. Of course, my imports don't work. Okay, and we need to attach this here. Import ref. Okay, that's a good start. What should we do next? I'm just going to switch this to a form as well. It'll be easier for us.
So we need to so we use ref for like focus, and so we need to put on click no, like even listener for button when we click, and this we focus on the input.
Yeah, that's a good point. We can do the focus. Let's for now ignore that just for simplicity.
Okay.
We can just assume that someone will click into this on their own to type, but that is a good call that we could add that.
We need to get the value first from the user.
Yep. So, yep, that's a good point. We need to actually extract out whatever is being typed in here. But how do we want to set that up? How do we know when to pull that value, and how do we want to do that?
So we make the handle button for on click button, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
when it, yeah, handle
Oh, go ahead.
function. Yeah.
Yep. So let's do a handle. I'll just call it handle search. What do we need to? How do we want to set this up here? And I switched this to be a form element here to make it hopefully a little bit easier for us.
So we will extract the value from the input here using input ref dot current dot value. No, we need okay. As in the lesson, they make the property of in the input like name value or
Mm-hmm.
yeah, in the input tag, yeah, we
Yep.
put the property like name equal
Yep.
value, yeah.
Yep. So we can call it maybe search box.
Okay,
So that's a good point. Or it's like search query, maybe. So that's a good point. The one good thing is I think given that we already have a ref here, we won't necessarily need the name to access the value. But not a bad idea to put this name property here.
yeah, we extract the value from in the handle search like
Yep.
create a constant, yeah, value.
Yep. So this would
And
be
input ref
yep.
dot dot current dot value or
Yep. It should be that. Great. Now, how do we make sure that this function is actually called? Let's
Uh,
for now. I'm just going to console log this to make sure that we can see it. But how do we make sure this actually is called when we click the button?
yeah, we put on the form or on the button, in the button or in the form.
Yep. And I would just say off the bat, generally when you have a form, it's typically just easier and best practice to attach to the form in this case. So we would attach it to the on submit here and then pass in this function. And then we should importantly need to tag this button as type submit so that it knows when this button is hit, it should call this on submit. Cool. I think let's try it, see what happens. So I'm going to open up the console and let me type something in like React. I'm going to click the search button. Okay, so that was actually very interesting what we just saw. So I'm going to show you again.
We missed even the prevent default. Oh yes.
Yes, exactly. So so we're just going to add here, technically this handle search should take an event in, and then yes, e.prevent default. Okay, so now if we try it, we click search, you can see we have this React being also logged out and the page is not being refreshed. And just to be super clear about that, because I realize it might just be like, what is this function? By default, when a form is submitted, it reloads the page. So that's why we just saw the behavior we did. When this was removed, let me just remove it. If I hit search, it actually just completely refreshes the page. That's why this input gets cleared out. That's why the console also gets cleared out because the page just gets refreshed. So normally we want to prevent that from happening, which is why we have the prevent default so that now we just don't have the page refresh. We can do whatever our custom logic is. Cool. Any questions on how we've set this up so far? Hopefully you all got a chance to work on your week 4 assignments, and so hopefully this should seem somewhat familiar. All right, so we've set this up. Right now we're just console logging the value, but let's actually have the search functionality here. So how do you think we should go about doing that? And again, I think the goal should be to match the search query against all the titles of the articles and use that essentially a way to search and see which articles fit that search query. So how would we go about thinking about that?
We need to take the value and then have a conditional statement to check the value if it's correct. Yeah, show the article.
Yep, that's a good start. But yeah, that's exactly right. We need to take the search query and we need to somehow check each of the elements here to see if they match. Anyone have any ideas on how we specifically might go about doing that here?
I think we need to create an array that have the 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 title which include the value.
Yep. So how exactly should we go about doing that?
So const some value some variable, yeah, equals what articles dot map, not
It might be a different function that might be more helpful here.
For each maybe.
There actually might be a different one. Also starting with F.
Filter.
Yes.
Filter.
Filter. There we
Okay.
go. Yeah, I see where you were going with, like, we could cycle through each of them, but filter will allow us to do it a little bit more cleanly. So, yep, I think what you were saying is take each article and then in this case we need to check, right, whether this search value is included in this article's title. And just to remind us what this article object looks like, I'll just go into dummy data. It has the title attribute, and that's what we're going to be checking against. So I think it would be a.title dot includes would be the function I would use here personally, and if it includes the search value. So just to be super clear about this, what we're saying is we're taking we'll need to fix something here in a second, but just for make sure we all understand, we're taking the list of articles, we're going to filter them, and the way we're going to filter them is we're going to check each article, and if the title of that article includes the search value that we've entered, then we will keep this article and save it in this new filtered articles list. Otherwise, we'll just remove it from the list. Okay, so we have this new list. What should we do with it?
So here we have the condition. If the filter article equals 0, so it will say there's no article, and if we find, so we will render the maybe list or count.
Yes, so I like where you're going with it in terms of we should have the empty list or the empty state. So let's make sure we add that. And actually, I'm just going to add a comment here, add an empty state for the list, which we'll do. But before we get to that, let's just have this render out. So specifically, how would we make sure this list of articles now gets rendered out?
Maybe we compare with the length of the array.
Not quite.
Okay.
Go ahead. I think you were going to say something else. So just a hint, remember how we set this up. We have this state, which is the list of articles, and we're passing that state down into the article list component that we had, which is actually rendering out this list. So given that setup, how do we take this new article list and make sure that we're showing it?
Maybe.
Oh, sorry. Go
No,
ahead.
no. You first.
Okay. I think using a set article function and then pass to the filter, yeah, this value.
Yep, exactly. So we're just going to update the state with this new value. Okay, so let's just try it and see what happens. So let's see. Let me close out console. Let's try it. So I'm going to search, let me refresh, and I'm going to search React. Well, that's probably a bad example because everything here has React. Let's search state, which should just be the last one. So if I search, look at that. It worked. We love to see. It's always good when things work on the first try. So that's great.
I have a question.
Now,
Can you explain the last piece, like the set articles
Yep.
equals filtered? articles. Like I would think maybe we would put it somewhere down on the return of the app, but can you explain why it would work, why it works there?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to take a step back, right? The way that we've configured this whole setup is we've set up this state variable at the top, which is articles, and we've set this to be, in this case, let me just change the name here because this is like bad naming. Dummy articles as full article data. Okay, so now that's better naming. Okay, so we said we have this article's state variable. Initially, we're going to set it to be the entire article data that we have. And just as a reminder, it's just this big array of a bunch of objects here with all this pieces of data. We've then said the way we're going to render this is we're going to take this article's state and we're going to pass it down into the article list component here just as a prop. And if we just go into that component, we can see here, we've just, to go through this very briefly, right? We take this articles prop, we come down here, and we map over this article array, and then we render out each article in an article card, which then shows all the individual title and all the other details of each article, right? So that's how we structure this. The beauty of it is, right, let's just try it, right? So currently to start with, it's the full data. I could go in here and say, I only want, or let's just change this to an empty array, right? If we change to an empty array initially and save it, all of a sudden we get an empty list, right? That's why we like state variables, because we can make those changes. So we're just taking advantage of that to say, well, if I update the value of this articles array, it will reflect in the UI because that's how all this works. So hence we're using that fact to say, okay, I'm going to now filter the list. And now I know this is the list I want to show now. So then I'm going to update the state variable to this new value. And then once I do that, it triggers a re-render of the entire component with this new values, and hence why it gives us just the filtered list.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. Other questions on this setup that we just did?
Just why we don't set, like I say, maybe I missed your, so why we don't use condition here before the set article? In the case filter article is just have the length is 0, so we need some conditional here before set articles.
Yeah, so I see where you're going with this. I think what you're asking, I think, if there's the articles to show, should we check for that first? So we should check for that. What we'll end up doing is we'll just set the article still to, like, in that case, an empty list. And then in the UI rendering, that's where we will check and say, hey, if this articles array is empty, then let's render out some like a header or something that just like there's articles or something like that. So we will just move that logic into the rendering logic instead, so that it will catch essentially examples where we just have empty data essentially.
Oh, okay, I see. Thank you.
Yep, but we'll get to that in a couple minutes. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think what you just showed kind of like give me a bit more clarity on use state, where we don't immediately articles change, set articles kind of like replaces it to show what we were supposed to show in terms of articles. All right, cool.
Yeah, exactly. It's as soon as you call this function, the whole component essentially like scraps itself and says, let me just start from scratch and re-render this entire return statement with the new values. So yeah, you're exactly right. You use this to essentially update the value here of this variable, and then it triggers a repaint essentially on the screen of what we should show. And this is really the power of React here. I mean, this is why it's called React, right? It's reacting to changes in this data and it's showing new UI. So this is really the power of the framework out that we're seeing. Okay, I want to highlight two issues that we currently have, and then let's talk about how we might fix them. So they're a little bit detailed. So the first is, okay, let's say I first, the styling and the state article, right? So let's say first I'm going to search for styling. Cool. Great, I've searched for styling. But now let's say I want to search for state. Oh, what happened? Nothing is showing. That's a bug. Does anyone see where that's coming from? Yes, it is because we rendered a state. It is related to that. Yes, okay, exactly. For that, I called it out correctly. So currently, we are saying filtered articles is filtering on the current value of the articles array. But if we search something, this articles array gets squished down to whatever the original filtering was. So if we filter again on it, it might not have anything to show. So what we need to do as a simple fix, this would be the simple fix I would do personally, is instead of filtering on articles, we should just filter on the entire article data here. So this full article data here, so the entire array. And this should prevent us from having this issue now of, if I search state now, look at that. If I can go back to styling, search that, now I have access back to the whole list. So that's a good call out. Another thing I'm just going to call out as a little bit of a nuance. So let's say I want to search for hooks. And of course, I'm lazy. So I'm just going to type everything in lowercase. And I hit search. Nothing is showing. Why is that? Does anyone want to anyone want to explain why that might be happening?
It's because it's different. We need to use like the hooks. There is the capital H in front. So I think in this case we need to use like maybe I don't remember that what called the no, not lower function. There's the searching the string. I forgot that what is name. The
Yeah,
method.
so you could be referring to a few things. You could potentially be referring to something called regular expressions or regex searching. But I'm
Yeah,
actually
regular.
yeah, regular expressions. Yeah. So, but I'm gonna actually go with what Fidel's suggesting, which is let's just to keep things super simple here, and this is pretty common. Let's just convert everything to lowercase, and then we'll just compare the lowercase versions of everything. I think that will just make our lives much easier here. So the way I'm just going to do this is it's a simple function. So what I would do is I would say a.title. Let's first make that lowercase, so that to lowercase. Nice function built in. I'll check if that includes lowercase version of the search value. So this will now make things case agnostic because we're converting everything to lowercase before we compare. Okay, so let's try it now. So if I search hooks, cool. Okay, so we're still matching properly. And now I can do like weird, crazy capitalization here, and it will still work. If I click search again. So another thing that is fixed now for us. So just a couple small things that these are pretty common nuanced things that you will see. So I just wanted to use this as a good way to highlight those. Cool. Any questions before we move on to a couple of other things that we want to do in the last few minutes? All right, so let's first quickly see if we can convert this exact same functionality to use control components instead of the useRef approach. How should we go about doing that? And hint, most of this can stay as is. It's just in a couple of places that we need to make some adjustments.
You asked that question again.
Yeah, so let's say we want to, instead of using references, let's get the same functionality but using the concept of control components that we talked about. So how should we start doing that?
Can we have a look at your example that you showed earlier?
Yes. Let me I think hopefully you can see my screen still. Is this it? Yes. Okay, this is it. Here's a little cheat sheet. Next door to it. Okay. So, what should we do?
So I think we need to first of all replace use red with articles as in set it as a prop to say articles equals articles as a prop. And then we also need to put set articles in the form as well
Yes.
after
Okay.
there's a change. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And I know you were saying article, but I think you meant the search terms itself or whatever. But yes, that's exactly right. So we need to essentially here, as Anthony was saying, instead of getting the search value by import ref.current.value, let's just make search value a state variable itself, right? So at the top, we'll just call it search value set search value. And remember, we're going to tie this to the value of the text box. So initially, it will just be an empty string. Let me comment this use ref. And as Anthony was saying, we need to also connect this up to input. So let's get rid of this ref. We don't need the name, so I'm going to get rid of it. We need to set, just like on the right-hand side, value, which will be the state variable, search value, and then the on change, which will say whenever the value here changes in the input, we need to set the value, set the search value to be e.target.value. And the last quick thing I'm just going to change here is now we don't need this thing here of input ref.current.value. In fact, because we named it the same, I'm just going to comment that out. And the search value should just pass through like before. Okay, let's try it. So I will search hooks. Okay, it's still searching, so that's good. Styling, great. We can do a partial search. We get the same thing. Great. So we quickly switch this over to use control components. Now, one quick thing I want to show you. If I forget to do this on change, and let's say I only attach the state variable to the value, watch what I mean, we can try it. Let's see what happens. I'm going to type something. I am typing, but you can see nothing is showing up in the text box. And this is because we've forgotten to say, hey, whenever the text box changes, we need to circle back and update the value in the state because we've already tied the value in the text box to whatever the state is. That's what we're showing in the text box. So if you ever come across this where you type stuff in and nothing's showing up, it's probably because we forgot to set this on change and close the loop here. So when I do that and I type things in, great. Now, this also works the other way around. If I forget to attach the value, if I start typing things in, it will work, but then it kind of won't work when we actually submit things. It will that we've lost the binding together. So reminder just to make sure you have both of those tied up. Any questions as we switch this over to control components?
I have a question. If you want to search something, if it doesn't exist, does it work or no?
Well, let's try it.
Okay.
Let's search. Ooh, React. Here, I'll search my name. Akil. Search it. It
Yeah.
works. I mean, essentially what would happen, right, is when we filter the articles, this will just come back as an empty array because it didn't find anything. So it will just display nothing. But as we were talking about earlier, we should, and we can do this in the last couple minutes here, is we should maybe show something to the user. Otherwise, the user might think this is broken, right? Because something is showing. That's a good call. And then in the chat, it seems like both work fine. Yes. Okay. So in general, I would say the control component approach is the more React way to do things because you now store this in a state variable. And so like you can have access to a lot more things. So just a really quick and dirty example just to show you something I can do now. So I can say, I don't want this search to fire unless there's something typed into this text box. Now, it turns out we can do this really simply now because there's a disabled state on the button. And I can set disabled to say, if the state variable search value is empty. So if search value is equal to an empty array or an empty string, then disable this button. But otherwise, you can make it work. So you can actually see now I've saved, and the button is now disabled. I mean, it's hovering in blue, but you can see it's grayed out now because it's been disabled. But now watch, as soon as I start typing something in, it becomes enabled. So that sort of thing starts to become viable now because we've now connected this all up into state. And so now we can use that state in a lot of different ways. This is just a simple like example of how it can be used. There's other things also we can do here. For example, we'll probably do this next week when we talk about use effect. We can actually get rid of the button altogether and say, as I type something into this text box, I want this list to live filter as I'm typing every character. We can do that now because we've set it up using control components and connected it to state. So on the surface, it might seem like you don't get any benefit, but turns out like it's the more React way to do things, and you can do a lot more interesting stuff. Okay, so I know we're at time, but let's just quickly add, if folks need to run, feel free to do that. Just final reminder, please fill out the attendance form and the feedback form as well if you have to run. But otherwise, let's just quickly implement the empty state that we've talked about. So I know we kind of talked about it already in the example, so let's just kind of apply that here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put this functionality in the article list component because I think that makes the most sense. And in the article list component here, I can check before I map to see if articles is just empty, right? If it's an empty array being passed in. So here I will say, I'll just do this separately and then we'll combine it. But I'll say if articles the length is equal to 0, then we can show some empty state. Like we can say, hey, no articles. Else we can do what we were doing before. And let me just copy then this in. And this will complain, which we'll fix very quickly by surrounding this in a fragment. Again, that is an important detail here. So let's just try it, and then I can come back and kind of explain this more in detail. But let's search something that we know is not here, which is like my name, Akil. If we search it, no articles. Okay, that's probably a bit too big, but there we go. We've shown that. But now if I still go and show something else, style, I get back the old list that we had before. Yes, I agree. Very cool. This is the power of React starting to show up now. Okay, so just to explain this again, and a little bit more slowly now, but this is the same as the example we saw earlier. So what we're doing is we've gone into the articles component, which is taking the articles as a prop. And before I render out this mapping, I just check to see first if articles.length is 0, so if the array is empty, then I will render out using the ternary operator this h1 tag, which, and it doesn't have to be an h1 tag, obviously it can be like a fancy like icon and little like animation. It can be whatever you want. In this case, we'll just do a simple h1. Otherwise, we will just render out the list as normal. Questions on that conditional rendering? All right. Well, I'll stick around. If there's any other final questions? Otherwise, thank you all for joining. Just as a reminder, again, if you haven't, fill out the attendance form. And also, if you have a chance to also share any anonymous feedback, if you have any, we'd appreciate that as well. But yeah, I'll stick around for any final questions you all might have.
Sorry, I have a question about the attendance. Do we need to click on the link and put our name?
Yes. So
I
in
haven't
this,
tried it yet.
yeah. So the link will not work, unfortunately, through the Zoom. So let me send it in the chat
Yeah,
as well.
thank you.
But yeah, just click on it or just copy it into your
Thank you.
web browser,
Okay.
and then yeah, it should be a super quick form.
Yeah, because I attended the another session before, but I didn't add my name because I didn't know what the. Thank you.
Ah, yes. Yeah, no worries. I think I saw you were there, so I did mark you as being there, but it's always safer
Thank
to
you.
fill out the form. But yeah.
Um, just one question. Is there anything
Mhm.
like uncontrolled component? Like is it uncontrolled form?
An uncontrolled component. Um, I guess technically speaking, like uncontrolled would be just like the normal way, like using a use ref. Like technically speaking, like no one calls it that, but like that would technically be it. I think the idea of
Okay.
like control, right, is this it just refers to this idea of like we've connected it to state in some way. So you have a binding essentially on the form.
All right.
So that's what it's really
Okay.
referring
Cool.
to. Yeah.
All right. Yep. All right. Cool. So in this example that you showed,
Yes.
um, maybe this will be out of scope or not very relevant to this class, but just to find out,
hmm
where does React store the information? For instance, the user input. Does it just straight away anytime it re-renders?
Um, so you're saying like where essentially does this like state variable get stored?
Yes.
Yeah, so this the state variable gets stored sort of like a little bit abstract. There's a bit of an abstraction that happens, right? So React has there's like there's two parts of a component, right? There is whatever the state is of that component,
Mm,
and then there is whatever the UI is, right? So what React fundamentally is like why it's so powerful is this idea of that the UI is a function of whatever the value of the state is at any given moment. And so in that case, the state itself will persist in a sense, right? Like throughout the re-renders. The re-render itself is really just re-rendering out this return statement, right? So the actual UI. That's what when we say
mm,
re-render, you're essentially like taking whatever is currently on the screen, throwing it away, and just like rerunning this return statement again, essentially with the updated values of the variables. That's really what a
okay.
re-render is. So it's like the state is sort of abstracted away from that, right? Because otherwise we'd kind of be in trouble, right? If
Yeah.
that was
All right.
also being cleared out. Now you have to be careful because like we are talking right now in the context of this specific component, right? But once you start going down layers, like just as an example, let's say like in article list, I mean, even if we go into article list now, right? Um,
Yeah.
you have to be careful because in article list, there is this like from last time, if you remember, like we have some state variables here from last time, right? For tracking stuff.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
The problem is here, if I change things that cause a re-render of this article, of this entire stuff, the article list gets re-rendered. That's the logic of React, right? Is like it will say all the
Yeah.
children also get re-rendered. So when the article list gets re-rendered, in that case, the article list state will get cleared out. If it was, updated in some way, like that will get cleared out completely from
Yeah.
scratch. So you have to be a little bit careful about that piece. Is kind of the children state getting cleared out if you're going to re-render all the time.
Okay. Right.
So that's just you'll have to track sort of how the data is flowing and there's certain ways you kind of will get around that, right? Or like strategies based on the situation, but that's something you'll have to keep in mind because of that.
Okay.